Princess Thalira stood at the balcony of her royal palace, gazing out at the sprawling city below. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the towering spires of her people's civilization. To anyone else, this view might have seemed perfect, but to her, it was just a reminder of the endless expectations she faced. She was the heir to an entire empire, and with that title came an unimaginable weight of responsibility. Every day, suitors from across the galaxy arrived to seek her hand in marriage, each one eager to gain her favor. They were strong, intelligent, and powerful, yet none of them caught her attention. Thalira had heard every flattering word, seen every extravagant gift, and listened to promises of alliances and power, but none of them mattered to her. She wasn't interested in love or marriage, at least not the way others saw it. To her, those things were distractions, tools to control her, to bend her will to the desires of others. "Your Highness, it is time for dinner," a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Zoran, her advisor, and one of the few people she truly trusted. He stood in the doorway, his expression gentle, but Thalira could see the worry in his eyes. "Coming," she replied, but before she turned to leave, she glanced back at the city once more. The peace she longed for seemed far out of reach. The thought of marriage, of being forced to choose one of these men, filled her with dread. None of them understood her, not in the way she needed. They only saw the crown, the title, and the power she could give them. She wasn't a person to them. She was a prize. As she walked to the dining hall, Thalira's mind raced. She had been trained for this life, trained to lead her people, to protect her empire. But no one had ever trained her for the loneliness that came with being a ruler. Her duties overshadowed everything else, and while the galaxy admired her strength and intellect, they could never see the part of her that longed for something more than a political alliance. That night, the dinner was filled with polite conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the quiet hum of people trying to impress her. The men she had met in the past were here again, each of them waiting for her to make a decision. But the truth was, she couldn't choose any of them. Not a single one of them made her feel anything beyond indifference. Thalira smiled politely as one of the suitors, a tall alien with sharp features, spoke about the advantages of their union. She nodded along, but inside, her thoughts drifted back to the balcony. Somewhere deep down, she knew she wasn't meant to settle for this. There had to be something more than this endless cycle of expectations. But for now, all she could do was listen. Listen to the empty words, the promises, and the proposals. In her heart, Thalira knew she couldn't let herself be swayed. She wouldn't marry just for the sake of duty, no matter what anyone else thought. The peace talks had been going on for days, but Princess Thalira's mind was far from the discussions at hand. She sat at the head of the grand table, listening to diplomats argue over trade routes and military alliances. She nodded occasionally, her eyes scanning the room, but her thoughts kept drifting to the human she had met only hours earlier. Captain Elias Trent was a mystery. He wasn't like the other diplomats from across the galaxy. Where the others were stiff, formal, and calculating, Elias was different. He carried an easy confidence, one that didn't rely on titles or power. He had walked into the royal chambers as though he belonged there, his gaze meeting hers with an unspoken challenge. Thalira had noticed him immediately. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his uniform a bit too casual for such an important gathering. But it wasn't his appearance that had drawn her in, it was his attitude. The human didn't seem intimidated by her status. In fact, he looked at her with a sort of curiosity, as if she were just another person in the room, not a royal princess. When the meeting had first begun, one of her advisors had made a sharp remark about the human's less than polished presentation. Thalira had bristled, but then Elias spoke up, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "I might not wear the finest robes or carry the weight of your titles, but I'm here to make sure we all walk out with something that benefits everyone. No grand speeches, just practical solutions." Thalira had felt something stir within her, a mixture of admiration and something she couldn't quite identify. It was unusual, this feeling, and it lingered long after the meeting had ended. Thalira found herself replaying his words, wondering what it was about him that made him stand out among the sea of sycophantic diplomats. After the meeting, as everyone began to disperse, Elias approached her. "Princess Thalira," he said with a smile, his tone respectful but not fawning. "I wanted to thank you for your time. It's not every day a human gets to sit at a table with such distinguished company." Thalira raised an eyebrow, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You speak as if you're the only one who doesn't belong," she said, amusement clear in her voice. Elias chuckled, his blue eyes sparkling with a sense of humor she hadn't expected. "Maybe it's because I don't play the game the way most of them do. But you, Princess, you don't seem to be interested in all their nonsense either." Her gaze softened slightly. He was right. Thalira wasn't like the others in the room. She wasn't interested in playing politics or pretending to care for the empty flattery. There was something real about Elias, something refreshing in the way he spoke. "You might be right," she said, meeting his gaze. For a moment, the rest of the room seemed to fade away. The noise of the gathering, the expectations of her people, and the endless suitors, all of it seemed distant. In that instant, there was just her and this human who dared to speak to her without fear. As Elias smiled at her, Thalira couldn't help but wonder if, for the first time in a long while, she had found someone who truly saw her for who she was. Princess Thalira couldn't stop thinking about Elias Trent. Each time she closed her eyes, his blue eyes seemed to linger in her thoughts, clear and focused, unlike anyone she had ever met. The way he had looked at her, not with awe, but with a sense of genuine curiosity, had unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. It was as though he saw something beneath the surface, something that no one else ever seemed to notice. The peace talks had continued, but Thalira found herself distracted. Every time Elias spoke, she paid closer attention, noting the calm way he navigated the complicated discussions. His words were simple but thoughtful, always focused on what could help both sides without the usual political tricks. His sincerity shone through, making him stand out among the other diplomats who spoke only to protect their own interests. It was during a break in the talks that Thalira found herself alone in the palace gardens, her thoughts heavy. The flowers around her were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to her inner conflict. She was the princess, heir to an empire. And yet Elias had made her feel something she hadn't felt in years: curiosity. But she couldn't afford to be curious. Her life was planned out for her. She had duties, responsibilities, and an empire to lead. She wasn't supposed to be thinking about a human diplomat. A rustling sound caught her attention, and she turned to see Elias stepping through the garden gate. He must have been walking outside for a break too. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, neither spoke. It was as though the entire world around them paused. "You seem far away, Princess," Elias said, breaking the silence. His voice was light, but there was an edge to it, as if he could sense her deep thoughts. "I suppose I am," Thalira replied, her tone softer than she intended. She didn't want to seem vulnerable, but she couldn't help it. There was something about Elias that made her lower her guard without realizing it. Elias smiled, walking closer. "Is it the talks, or something else?" he asked, his voice teasing but still respectful. Thalira hesitated, torn between her royal duties and the unexpected connection she felt to him. "Both, I suppose," she said honestly. "The talks are complicated, and I'm expected to make decisions that I'm not sure I agree with." Elias nodded as if he understood. "I've seen a lot of leaders in my life. They often talk about what's best for their people, but sometimes they forget what's best for themselves. You seem different. You don't wear your crown like a burden." Thalira felt a strange warmth in her chest. No one had ever spoken to her like that. People only saw the princess, the future ruler, never the person beneath the crown. But Elias saw her as more than that. He saw the part of her that longed for something real, something beyond power and politics. "You may be right," she whispered, her gaze drifting to the flowers again. She didn't know why, but something in Elias made her feel like she wasn't alone in the world anymore. As they stood there, a simple silence between them, Falira realized that for the first time in her life, she was no longer certain about the future she had always known. The grand hall was filled with the sounds of cheering as the alien nobles gathered to watch the traditional contest of strength. It was a spectacle held once every few years, where guests could showcase their physical abilities in a series of challenges. Falira had attended these events many times, but this time, something felt different. Today, she wasn't just a spectator. Elias Trent, the human diplomat, had been invited to compete. Falira had agreed to the challenge, curious to see how he would fare against some of her empire's strongest warriors. She had already heard whispers among her court. Many believed the human would fail miserably. But Elias, confident in his abilities, had accepted without hesitation. Falira watched as Elias stepped forward, his broad shoulders relaxed, despite the intense eyes of the gathered crowd. He wore simple clothing, nothing as extravagant as the alien warrior's colorful armor, but there was something in his posture that spoke of quiet strength. He seemed unfazed by the alien creatures around him, all of whom were considerably larger and more muscular than he was. "The first challenge is strength," the announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "Each competitor will lift the weighted stone and hold it for as long as possible. The heaviest stone will test their endurance and power." The massive stone was brought out, a block of metal so large it required several warriors to carry it into place. Falira couldn't help but watch closely. The stone was heavier than anything humans could typically manage, and many of her suitors and court members were already looking at Elias with quiet mockery. They were certain he would fail. The first few competitors tried, each one showing off their strength. One by one, they managed to lift the stone with a grunt, holding it above their heads for several seconds before they gave in to the weight. Their bodies trembled with effort, but their pride kept them standing as long as they could. Finally, it was Elias's turn. Without a word, he stepped up to the stone. The room went silent. Elias didn't hesitate. He crouched down, his hands gripping the heavy metal with ease. His muscles tensed, and slowly, steadily, he lifted the stone. The crowd watched in shock as Elias lifted the stone higher, his focus never wavering. The whispers died down as his arms held the stone above his head, not for seconds, but for minutes. Falira's heart raced as she watched Elias hold the stone effortlessly. His arms were strong, but it wasn't just physical strength that impressed her. It was the sheer determination in his eyes. He wasn't doing this to show off or gain favor. He was doing this because he could. And that was something Falira respected deeply. As the time passed, Elias's muscles began to tremble, but he didn't stop. His grip remained firm, and his breathing slowed, his entire focus on the task before him. After what felt like an eternity, Elias gently lowered the stone, his breath heavy, but his expression proud. The room erupted into applause, and Falira couldn't help but join in. The human had done the impossible. He had shown the strength and endurance of a true warrior, far beyond what anyone had expected. Elias turned to face her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Well, princess, it seems I've passed your test." Falira's eyes met his, and for a moment she could only nod, unable to put into words the admiration she felt. In that moment, Elias had proven himself not just as a diplomat, but as someone who had earned her respect in a way no one else ever had. The tension in the royal palace was palpable. Falira could feel it in the air as she entered the grand hall for the evening banquet. Her advisors, ministers, and suitors filled the room, all of them offering their opinions on the state of the empire. The talks with the humans had gone well, but there was a greater issue looming over her head, the pressure to choose a suitor. "Your Highness, the council awaits your decision," Zoran, her most trusted advisor, said softly as he walked beside her. "It's time. The empire can't wait forever for you to make up your mind." Falira's eyes flicked over to the gathering of suitors across the room. Each one of them had their own offer, their own reasons for wanting her hand in marriage. They came from powerful families, influential planets, and rich alliances. But to Thalira, they were just faces, faces who saw only the crown she wore, not the woman beneath it. She hadn't made a decision. How could she? None of these men truly knew her. They didn't understand the burden she carried or the dreams she held deep inside. They only saw her as a tool, a way to gain power, wealth, or influence. Her marriage, they all seemed to think, was a transaction, not a partnership. As she made her way to her seat at the head of the table, her mind wandered to Elias. He had no desire for power, no need for a throne. He had proven that in their conversations, in the way he treated her, not as a princess, but as an equal. Thalira felt something stir in her chest when she thought of him, something that made the weight of her crown feel a little lighter. But she couldn't allow herself to entertain such thoughts. Elias was a human. He didn't belong in her world, not in the way the others did. Her people wouldn't accept him, her advisors would never approve, and the political consequences would be disastrous. She was the princess, and her duty was to her empire, not her heart. As the banquet began, Thalira's mind remained elsewhere. She answered questions, nodded politely, and smiled when necessary. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Elias. His quiet confidence, his kindness, and his refusal to treat her like a prize to be won. They were all so different from the men around her. Zoran's voice brought her back to reality. "Princess, they are waiting for your response," he said, gesturing toward the suitors who had gathered, all looking at her expectantly. Thalira's heart sank. The choice was supposed to be hers, but she felt like she was being forced into a corner. If she chose one of these men, it would be for the sake of the empire, for the sake of peace. But if she rejected them all, it would be seen as a sign of weakness. She would be blamed for the instability that followed. With a heavy sigh, she stood, turning to face the room. The suitors waited in silence, their eyes fixed on her, but Thalira saw nothing but a blur of faces. The decision was hers to make, but it felt as if the weight of the entire galaxy was on her shoulders. But then, a thought flickered in her mind. Maybe it wasn't just about duty. Maybe, for once, it could be about what she truly wanted. The news of Princess Thalira's decision spread quickly throughout the palace, and soon, whispers filled every corner of the empire. Thalira had defied centuries of tradition, turning her back on the royal suitors in favor of a human diplomat. The empire had always expected its rulers to make choices based on power and alliances, but Thalira had chosen something else, something far more personal. The royal court was in chaos. Advisors and nobles stormed through the corridors, unsure of what this bold move meant for the future of the empire. But Thalira remained calm, sitting in the palace gardens, her hands folded in her lap, as the sun dipped low in the sky. Beside her, Elias stood silently, his presence a comfort. He didn't need to say anything. The quiet connection between them spoke louder than any words could. Thalira had made the right choice, one that was true to herself. For the first time, she felt like the weight of the crown wasn't crushing her. Elias finally broke the silence. "Are you sure about this?" His voice was gentle, but there was a hint of concern in it. Thalira looked up at him, her eyes soft. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life. It's scary, but I'm ready." He smiled, and she could see the warmth in his eyes. She wasn't alone anymore. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, political battles, and enemies to face. But with Elias by her side, she knew she could handle whatever came their way. Days passed, and Thalira stood by her decision. She met with her council and explained her reasons, her voice strong but kind. She told them that her heart had led her to Elias, and she wouldn't marry out of duty. Slowly, the council began to listen. Some were still skeptical, but others saw the sincerity in her eyes. They had always respected her strength, and now they saw that strength was also in following her heart. As the weeks went by, Thalira continued her work as the ruler of the empire, but now She had someone she could truly trust at her side. Elias wasn't just a diplomat. He became her partner, her equal. They worked together, making decisions for the Empire with a new sense of unity and understanding. The Empire began to shift, slowly at first, but then more confidently. Thalira's people saw her not just as a ruler, but as a woman who had the courage to follow her heart and choose her happiness. They saw that the future of their empire didn't lie in alliances or arranged marriages. It lay in the strength of their ruler and the love she had for those she trusted. One evening, as Thalira and Elias walked through the palace gardens, Elias stopped and turned to face her. "We've come a long way," he said, his eyes full of affection. Thalira smiled and took his hand. "We have, and I wouldn't have it any other way." The sky above them was painted in shades of orange and pink as they stood there, side by side. Together, they would face whatever challenges came their way, not as a princess and a diplomat, but as two people who had chosen each other. A new beginning had started, and for the first time, Thalira truly felt free. The great hall was filled with the murmur of voices as Thalira walked through the doors, her heart beating faster with every step. The suitors were waiting, their eyes trained on her, each one ready for her decision. The room seemed to grow quieter as she entered, the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders. Zoran, standing at her side, looked at her with a mix of pride and concern. He had been her advisor for years, guiding her through countless decisions, but this one was different. This time, Thalira wasn't just making a decision for the Empire, she was making one for herself. And that, Zoran knew, was a choice that carried more weight than any political alliance. Thalira stood before the gathered suitors, her gaze sweeping over each one. They were powerful, wealthy, and influential, but none of them had ever truly seen her for who she was. They saw her as a prize, a means to an end. They didn't care about her heart or her dreams, only what she could do for them. Princess Thalira, one of the suitors, a tall, broad-shouldered alien, spoke with a deep voice. "We await your decision. The future of the Empire depends on this." Thalira looked at him, her mind sharp but her heart heavy. The weight of his words should have made her feel confident, but all she felt was exhaustion. She didn't want to make this choice. She didn't want to pick between duty and love, between her people and her heart. But she knew, deep down, that it was time. She couldn't ignore her own feelings any longer. Without looking at the suitors, Thalira spoke, her voice steady. "I've made my decision." The room went quiet. Zoran's eyes widened, and the suitors leaned forward, waiting for her words. Thalira took a deep breath before continuing. "I will not marry any of you," she said, her voice calm but firm. "My duty to my people is clear, but I will not sacrifice my happiness, my future, or my heart for an alliance that doesn't honor me as a person." The suitors exchanged shocked glances, and Thalira could feel the tension in the air. They had expected her to choose one of them, to solidify her power. Instead, she was choosing something entirely different, something that would shake the very foundation of what they thought was her duty. Thalira turned to Zoran, who looked as if he were about to speak, but she held up a hand to stop him. Her gaze was steady now, unwavering. "I will lead this empire on my own terms. I will find a way to balance my duty and my heart. But I will not marry for the sake of politics. I will marry because I choose to, because I have found someone who sees me for who I truly am." The room remained silent, and for the first time, Thalira felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. She had made her choice. She had chosen herself. As the suitors turned to leave, clearly stunned by her decision, Elias stepped forward, his eyes meeting hers with an understanding that no one else in the room could match. "Princess," he said softly, his voice filled with warmth, "I'm here, if you'll have me." Thalira smiled, her heart finally at ease. For the first time in a long time, she felt the freedom of choosing her own path, knowing that with Elias by her side, she didn't have to carry the burden of the throne alone. The evening air was cool as Thalira walked through the quiet corridors of the palace. The banquet had ended, and the palace had returned to its usual hum, filled with whispers and the rustle of silk. Yet Thalira felt far from the luxury and the rules that surrounded her. She was alone, lost in her thoughts, her mind circling back to the conversation with Elias earlier in the day. His words echoed in her ears, reminding her of the one thing she couldn't ignore. He saw her, not as a ruler, but as a person. She knew she shouldn't feel this way. She had responsibilities, a duty to her empire. But Elias was different. He didn't want her title, her power, or her kingdom. He just wanted her. And it made her heart ache in a way she couldn't explain. "Princess," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Thalira turned to find Elias standing in the doorway of one of the palace's quiet sitting rooms. He looked out of place here, his human clothing simple compared to the ornate attire of her people. But in that moment, he seemed more at ease than anyone in the palace. "I didn't mean to startle you," Elias said, stepping into the room. His eyes were soft, and there was a warmth in his smile that made Thalira's heart beat a little faster. "I just wanted to speak with you." Thalira nodded, trying to hide the fluttering in her chest. "What about?" she asked, her voice calm, though her thoughts were anything but. Elias took a step closer, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made her feel both nervous and safe at the same time. "I've been thinking about everything that's happening here," he said, his tone thoughtful. "The pressure, the expectations, the choices you're being forced to make. I know it's not easy." Thalira didn't speak at first. How could she? She had spent so long keeping her feelings locked away, thinking she could handle everything on her own. But Elias, he understood. In a way, no one else did. "I don't want to make the wrong choice," she admitted quietly. "I don't want to disappoint my people, but I can't keep pretending everything is fine." Elias didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence comforting and steady. For a moment, there was only the soft sound of their breathing, the silence hanging between them like an unspoken truth. Then, without warning, he reached out, gently taking her hand. Thalira's breath caught in her throat, the simple touch sending a wave of warmth through her body. She looked up at him, her heart racing. She could feel the pull between them, a connection that she had tried so hard to ignore. "Princess," Elias whispered, his voice low and sincere, "you don't have to carry this alone. Whatever happens, whatever you decide, I'm here." Thalira felt a tear well up in her eye, though she quickly blinked it away. She wasn't sure what this meant, what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she didn't have to be the princess, the ruler, the perfect heir. She could just be Thalira. And Elias wasn't asking for anything else. In that quiet moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had found someone who could see her heart, not just her crown. The days after the strength contest seemed to drag on for Princess Thalira. The peace talks had taken another turn, and with each passing meeting, the weight of her responsibilities grew heavier. But it wasn't just the pressure of ruling that kept her distracted. Elias Trent was always in the back of her mind, his image lingering long after their encounters. She couldn't deny it any longer. Every conversation, every glance, felt different with him. There was something about Elias that made her feel like she wasn't just a princess or a ruler, but a person. He didn't look at her as a figurehead, as so many others did. He looked at her like she was someone he wanted to understand, someone he wanted to know. That evening, after a long day of discussions, Thalira found herself walking alone in the royal gardens again. It had become a ritual of sorts, a quiet escape from the chaos inside the palace. She walked along the stone path, lost in thought, her mind constantly returning to Elias. "You've been walking alone again, princess," a familiar voice broke through her thoughts. Thalira turned to see Elias stepping from behind a column, a warm smile on his face. The sight of him caught her off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. Her heart raced, a feeling she wasn't used to, but she quickly masked it with a calm expression. "I enjoy the solitude," she replied, her voice steady. Sometimes it's the only time I can think clearly. Elias nodded, understanding in his eyes. I get that. Being surrounded by people all the time can be overwhelming. He paused, his gaze softening as he looked at her, especially when everyone expects so much from you. Thalira's breath caught in her throat. The words felt too familiar, too close to what she had been feeling for so long. She had never met anyone who truly understood the weight of her crown, the constant pressure to always be perfect, always be the ruler. Until now. You're right, she admitted, her voice quieter now. I can never seem to escape it. The expectations, the rules, the constant need to be strong. Elias took a step closer, his presence calm but grounding. It's okay to be human, you know. It's okay to want more than just power and control. His words were gentle, but they struck deep. Thalira wasn't used to hearing such honesty, especially not from someone like him, a human, with no ties to her empire, yet somehow more understanding than any of her people. They stood in silence for a moment, the quiet of the garden wrapping around them. Thalira could feel the weight of Elias's gaze on her, not as a diplomat or a conqueror, but as someone who saw her. Just her. Not the crown she wore, not the responsibilities that tied her down. I didn't expect you to understand, she whispered, almost to herself. Elias smiled softly, his voice low and sincere. Maybe I understand more than you think, princess. Maybe that's why I'm here. For the first time in weeks, Thalira allowed herself to relax, to breathe without the pressure of her title. She didn't have to be perfect, not with him. And for that moment, nothing else mattered. The palace was quiet that night, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts racing through Thalira's mind. She had spent hours pacing the grand halls, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The weight of the decision she had to make felt heavier than any crown. Elias's words echoed in her mind. You don't have to carry this alone. She had never imagined that she would have someone by her side who truly understood her struggles, someone who didn't care about her title, her power, or the empire she was meant to rule. Elias cared about her as a person, and that was something Thalira had never experienced before. The idea of choosing him, of breaking away from the expectations of her people, scared her more than anything. But it wasn't just fear that held her back. Thalira knew the consequences. If she chose Elias, the human, over her suitors, it would be seen as an insult to her people. Her advisors would turn against her, and her people would question her ability to lead. She would lose everything she had worked for, the empire, her title, the respect she had earned. But there was something else, something Thalira had only recently come to understand. The true cost of rejecting her heart. The loneliness that came with her crown was suffocating, and Elias had shown her that she didn't have to live that way. She didn't have to choose between love and duty. Thalira stood in front of the palace's great window, looking out at the city beneath her. The lights of the city twinkled like stars, reminding her of the vastness of her responsibilities. She was the future of her empire, the one everyone relied on. She had never let anyone in, never allowed herself to think of anything other than her role as a ruler. But now, the choice before her felt more personal than anything she had ever faced. As she stood there, lost in thought, a soft knock on the door broke her from her reverie. It was Zoran, her trusted advisor, his expression unreadable as he stepped into the room. "Your Highness," he began, his tone respectful but firm. "The time has come for you to make a decision. The suitors are waiting. The council is growing restless." Thalira turned to face him, her heart pounding. She knew what was expected of her. Zoran had always been by her side, guiding her, advising her. But she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. She wasn't just a princess. She was a person with desires, dreams, and a heart that beat for more than just the throne. "I know," Thalira replied softly, "but I don't know if I can make the choice everyone expects." Zoran stepped closer, his expression softening. "You are not alone in this, Thalira. You've always been a ruler, but you are also a person. You must choose what makes you happy. The empire will survive as long as you have the strength to lead, but your happiness, your peace, matters just as much. Thalira's heart lifted at his words. Maybe she didn't have to choose between love and duty. She could forge her own path, one where she wasn't forced to sacrifice her heart for the sake of her empire. With a deep breath, Thalira made her decision. She would follow her heart, even if it meant facing the unknown. Elias had given her the courage to choose herself.